All right, hello everybody. Welcome to the October 29th, 2016 special edition of Kubernetes SIG Service Catalog. Where we left off, our heroes were discussing directions forward and next steps after the code drop. I think any of you that have been paying attention in the GitHub repo have seen there's been a lot of movement today. We've already got some folks that are acting on those next steps. And so let me kick this conversation off by jogging everybody's memory. The last thing that we discussed in yesterday's meeting were some code moves of the brokers to contrib brokers and examples to contrib examples. There have been, as I said, some other subsequent pull requests today that have been along the lines of making the project structure more similar to Kubernetes, which I think is a good thing to do. Now I wonder, from the discussion yesterday, does anybody have next steps that they would like to discuss today? And if so, let's all discuss them now.
I would put CI on the list. It was one of the issues that you, Paul, opened, and yes. I think if we go too long without, things will break.
Yes, I agree. I will put that on the agenda for today. And I think that is a good thing, but not especially intrinsic to yesterday's conversation. So any other hanging chads from yesterday that we need to address?
Not entirely sure if this applies, so you tell me. We had discussion in Slack about the lgtm labels and the veto labels. That is in issue number 50.
Okay. I think that's fine to discuss. Aaron, would you like to summarize that for the group, and maybe we can just perhaps see how everybody feels while we're all convened here together?
Sure. I created issue 50. We had discussion in Slack. There were a bunch of alternative possibilities brought up. I think pullapprove.io or .com or something was brought up. I had never heard of it, so I did some research on that. We had Garrett for GitHub brought up. And then we also still have the current situation where we put LGTMs and I'm assuming vetoes into comments, which is still on the table, I believe, as an option. I put at the bottom of that issue, a second comment to the bottom on that issue, a proposal for how to use labels to do this. And then I just saw Vile put a response to that. So I'll put a link to the issue into the chat. And
that'd be great.
That's the summary.
All right, so okay. Vile, I see that you already have registered some comments on this. Your comments were, it's insufficient to apply a veto label without justification. And then there was a question about LGTM, but there's a few tiny things that need to be fixed. So let me just say, when it comes to LGTM labels, if there are things that need to be fixed, it is not LGTM. It can be LGTM modulo nits in a comment, and if we choose to go with this labels thing, don't apply the label. But if something needs to get fixed, it is not LGTM, in my opinion, unless there is a explicit agreement that it can be fixed in a follow-up, which is something that happens with some regularity. Any thoughts about that?
So
that sounds fine.
So aren't there possibly circumstances where something might look good to everybody and, you know, might have received the required amount of approval from 3 people, but for whatever reason, we don't want to merge it yet.
If we don't want to merge it, it shouldn't be LGTM in the first place, in my opinion.
Okay, that's fair.
Well, the corner case that comes to mind is the one where there are 3 LGTMs, but within less than 24 hours, and there is one still has to wait for the timer to expire and wait for vetoes, technically.
That's a fair point.
Yeah, and I actually don't think that we were enforcing the timeout rigidly today. I'll be honest with you folks. I think that the moves and stuff that we're doing now are probably not ones where veto is likely. I think that it is sufficient to me to have a gentle person's agreement amongst us all that we'll act in good faith and we'll use our best judgment about when something may be controversial. And I think, you know, to make expedient progress on things everybody agrees on that are low impact, that it's probably not especially necessary, but I think that you know, being a good citizen is part of, like, if there's a dimension of doubt and you think there is some ambiguity, that it is polite to let the time elapse.
I totally agree to favor expediency in absence of doubt.
Okay. So I think that it would be great if we could like write this protocol in a document that lives in the repo and have that to point newcomers to, because you know, assuming that we are successful in our mission, we will eventually have many, many more people coming and being interested in contributing to this project. And one experience that I've learned with Kubernetes is that it can happen without warning, that suddenly everybody will want to jump into the pool. So if we could get a volunteer to produce a document with this information that goes into the repo in a pull request, I think that would be great. It sounds like we're very close to agreement, and probably we can work through any remaining nits in a pull request. Anybody disagree? I'm not hearing disagreement. Okay, who's gonna raise their hand first?
I will do it.
All right, Old Faithful, Aaron, it's on you. I'm gonna miss you.
There's still the question of difference between LGTM3 and merge.
I think that was answered by the corner case of, let's just say the 3 people look at it in the first hour and they're like, yeah, this looks the bomb diggities, but then you want to go and wait for 23 hours for somebody to veto it. I think.
So my own take on this is that LGTM3 as a label is meant as an attestation that a specific person said that it was LGTM. I think it can have LGTM3 and under the best judgment rationale, if it's not controversial, if no one expects it to be controversial, it's probably okay to merge. If there's any dimension of doubt, let the timeout elapse, be a good citizen, and you know, give it a day. With that said, if we continue meeting more frequently than once a week, probably much of the work that is done will already have been discussed over some type of video chat or in person. Me being optimistic about everybody's travel budget there. So for things like that, it's probably It also probably lowers the need to have the timeout. But again, this is an area where good judgment and being a good citizen are very important. And we can write down that people use their best judgment, but what matters the most is that people actually do.
So are we all cool with, let's say a core maintainer does an LGTM3? Are we cool with, if it's been a day, that person can label and merge immediately?
Yeah, I think so. I think the clock starts ticking when the PR starts kicking.
So rather than focus on the LGTM3, I'd still like to understand the need for the LGTM labels at all. I don't understand what value they bring. I can understand a label that says this thing's ready to get merged and we're just waiting for the timeout. But I don't understand the 1, 2, and 3. I got to be honest. Okay.
When you say you don't understand, can I ask, do you think it's unnecessary, or are you willing to live with it for now? And if it's really cumbersome, we can change.
I think it's unnecessary. I can live with just about anything.
Okay.
I can grumble to myself all day long. That's fine. I do anyway. Yeah. But I do think it's unnecessary. I mean, I don't see the difference between 1, 2, and ready to merge. I'm sorry. I don't understand the difference between just putting a number there because it doesn't tell me anything. I can't query on it for any purpose other than that I can know someone has LGTM'd it, but it doesn't tell me whether I have or not. So it doesn't reduce the list of things that I need to look at if I do a query. I just don't see the point.
Okay. Then Aaron, perhaps you or someone else from DAIS can explain the rationale. Do you feel that there is a value add for labels over comments? I'm completely agnostic on this mechanism, for the record.
I'll let Kent, you want to explain this one?
Yeah, so I do personally feel that there's a value to it. I know, so at DAIS, we've been working this way for a long time. I'm certainly not advocating that we do this just because it's what we're familiar with. I do actually believe there's value to it. A lot of us have created queries that we've bookmarked that allow us to look at individual projects or across many projects and look very quickly and easily at things that may need our attention. Doug has made some very good points about, if we don't all have our own personalized labels, you don't really have a way of saying, okay, find me the things that I haven't already approved. And that's absolutely true. But this is, I would say, I would qualify it as good enough that you can write a query where you can look at open work items that have not received the required number of LGTMs or have not been vetoed or so forth or so on. You can query along those dimensions and you can see in the index view a list of things that might deserve your attention. So, as a for instance, if, you query and, 50 different PRs come up and one of them has 3 LGTMs and many, many others do not, you might not want to focus your attention on the one that has the 3 LGTMs already. You might want to spend your efforts elsewhere. So I do think that it's kind of useful as a progress bar of sorts to show how far something is in the process and where you in particular might want to focus your efforts.
Okay, I think that makes sense to me. Doug, are you convinced by that?
No, because to be honest, if there's one out there that has 3 LGTMs, that's actually one that I would focus on. I'd try to look and see why we couldn't push it over the line. It seems to me that you get the exact same effect by doing a query that says, find me a PR that's, over a day old and has not been vetoed and has a comment with LGTM in it somewhere. That will give you almost the exact same result.
So, Doug, I think you may accidentally have just made an argument in favor of the labels, because you said that if something had 3 LGTMs, you might be giving additional focus to it. So without those labels, you wouldn't be able to easily identify those items. Isn't that correct?
I totally agree, yes. But my point in saying that wasn't because I actually care about that as much as you would say you'd want to avoid them. I don't think you should avoid any PRs because of the number of LGTMs.
Well, whether the labels are there for the sake of avoiding particular PRs or for targeting particular PRs is really kind of inconsequential. The important thing is that the metadata exists so that you can query along whatever dimensions matter to you. It's not for me to say what matters to you or for you to say what matters to me, but as long as the metadata is there, we can both work as we please.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. If that's what people want to do, that's fine. Like I said, I can live with just about anything. It's just extra work for people to do it, because I typically forget to do labels. I'm constantly being reminded by the Docker guys to update the labels appropriately, and I can just tell you, it's just another thing that I forget. So, but I can live with it.
So I'm sorry if I missed something in an earlier conversation or in the Slack channel or something, but it seems to me that we're arguing about or discussing like what mechanism we should do to get code approved so that it can be merged.
Yes, that is exactly right.
But we're talking about mechanics, and I haven't really heard or seen a concise description of what behaviors or what are we trying to accomplish with said mechanics? Like what is the thing we're trying to ensure does or does not happen? And if you can describe that in English, then maybe we can say, hey, we could solve this in 15 different ways. Maybe one of them is with labels and 3 variants of LGTM and veto and all this other stuff. But it seems like we're talking about mechanics without having agreed on what the purpose is.
Yeah, so my own impression of the purpose is to, it's very rough, it's not detailed now, but in my mind, the purpose is to ensure that we have sufficient group buy-in without describing what the decision plane for is something LGTM. But, and if we find that to be something that is useful to do, then we can explore it. But basically, I think the point of this mechanism is to ensure that everybody has time to review, and that the reviewers, or that each change is reviewed and attested to its fitness to go in by at least 3 people. Now, I will interject also into my own sentence that I think that there are other things that have a higher utility to address as a group. And so what I propose is that we take about 30 seconds. If anybody strongly disagrees that this is movement in the right direction on the subject of governance, I would really like to make some progress on governance, and then there are other things that I think are very important to discuss that I'd like to get to today. And we're 20 minutes into this out of an hour. Does anybody have any reservations that are strong enough that they think we should fundamentally reassess what has been discussed so far and continue to spend time on it here, with the knowledge that if a need arises, that we can easily bring this back up for discussion, further elaboration, further formal outlining of what we think LGTM is?
Well, I mean, I'm wondering if it's been explicitly stated that the 3 LGTMs can't be from the same organization, right? Like if 3 of the Google guys, all LGTM, a Google PR, that doesn't seem like the right thing, right? Or substitute any other organization. I mean, should there be some sort of, the LGTM should be coming from different entities, or you get 1 vote per company, or like I don't know. I mean, obviously nobody's going to try to abuse anything, but I'm just trying to get at what is the what is the end goal? We want to make sure that, we're all in agreement as a community, right?
So yes, that is correct. We haven't discussed the need for different companies. I'm willing to give this another 5 minutes if we would like to discuss that now. But I will note, so far, I don't think there's been any situation where an LGTM has come from more than one person at a particular company on a particular issue. I think we've been informally doing that so far. I would support making it formal if that's what the group has appetite for.
Another point is, if we are intuitively doing the right thing, do we need a set in stone process codified that actually brings up a lot of controversy, because we're getting into the legal speak, and once the language is written down, the intent gets hidden in the corner cases that arise.
So could I bring up a possible, lack of a better term, easy out in this discussion?
Please.
And that would just be, let's add a veto label and then put off the LGTM discussion, stick with our informal procedure now, and see how far that will take us.
I think that is a sensible thing to do. I would like to see a show of agreement or dissent in the chat. Kent dissents.
I think the word is veto.
Okay, well, this is a vote.
You need a label.
That's right. I can't see without a label.
Okay. Kent, I'm sorry, but you appear to be outnumbered. Aaron, I think if you will proceed as we've discussed here, if you would like to just make a note in the issue as to what you're going to do, that will be good. And I'm totally fine continuing to have the governance-like discussions, but we do need to be conscientious about how we allocate time. So at this point, I'd like to move on to a design discussion, unless there are any additional things that we need to discuss around governance or next steps from the code draw that have not already been discussed. Is everybody okay with that? All right, I hear no dissent. New dissent. All right, so let me share a link in the chat to an issue that I've created. Now, this issue is on unbind. I am not sure how many of you have read it. It is not necessary to have read it to participate in this discussion because I want to kind of walk through it. So this is the video chat version of issue 39. So in the face-to-face meetings that we had really good productive consensus around the general shape of things and usage of the API up through the following. Someone adds a broker. The controller has a watch on the broker resource, goes and hits the V2 catalog endpoint, gets the service classes from the broker, persists them into the API server. Service consumer says, hey, I want an instance of the service class. They create an instance. Controller goes and calls the provision endpoint, controller updates the status of this resource. Later, service consumer says, I want to do a binding against this instance. And we've gotten up through the constructive portion of this, right? Like we've gotten to the point from empty catalog to now I've got an application with a binding. And I think a logical next step to discuss is what happens when you want to do an unbind. So the precedent that we have for this in Kubernetes is in storage for persistent volumes and persistent volume claims. When you want to release a claim on a persistent volume, you delete the claim. This doesn't analogize perfectly to the service catalog world, because once you declare your intent to unbind, there's work that has to be done. So it's not as simple as you delete a resource and then it's gone and the controller can figure that out, right? Because the controller has to ensure that if it misses the delete event, that it can still have a way to understand that it has to go and do something without keeping a local cache that persists across controller restarts. So the pattern that we have in Kubernetes to accomplish these types of things is called finalization. And basically, let me draw a picture for you all. In cooking show style, I have prepared a whiteboard. Can everybody see this?
Amazing.
Nope. I heard a nope.
That's better.
Okay. All right. Can you see the stick figure guy over here?
Just out of range, no.
Okay. Let me back this thing up. See if I can get more in the shot. Okay. How about now?
Once you move your shoulder, yep, there he is. Got it.
All right. So, this is my it's not off the top of my head impression of how we could use this pattern in service catalog, but it's a possibility I've spent a little time mulling over. And so this diagram should look familiar to everybody on this call at this point. It's a simplified version because I think we've probably all got this in our heads. I'm happy to add any more detail if it's desired, but basically I've written down the material posts and gets and puts that are central to understanding the API flow that I've described so far. Everybody cool with what's on this board? I'm not hearing no. Okay, so here's my, I won't call it a pitch, let's just call it a thing. Here's my thing. So gonna use green for new stuff. And we've already done a post on this binding. So the binding exists. The protocol that we've all discussed so far has been carried out, where I posted, I'm the service consumer in this case, the service consumer has posted the binding. It's gone into the API server, persisted in etcd, controller has watch on API server, and has done a put on the E2 service instance bindings endpoint on the broker. All right, and so life is good, and I say, hey, now I want to unbind from this thing. So analogizing imperfectly to the current precedent that we have for this, say that to declare my intent to do to unbind, I do a delete. On this binding. And at that point, what happens is that the REST API says, okay, the service consumer wants to delete this resource. And instead of going out and carrying out the delete, we know that there is some work that has to be done. So we need to keep this, this resource around and put it into record somehow on its status that it's being deleted or being unbound or being finalized, named TBD, but that we're entering the end game for this resource. So say, for example, that the REST API records a condition in this binding status that says this has a deleting condition that's true. And so what happens after this is that the API server gives back a 203 accepted.
202, yeah.
Sorry. You will find that I have very imperfect knowledge of HTTP, so I accept the suggestion. 202 accepted. I'm trying to figure out how to draw this. So the one thing that happens in here is that the state, or I'm sorry, the status has a, let's call it a deleting condition. And the controller has a watch on this binding resource and says, aha, I've got an update event for this binding. And I see deleting condition is true. And here's where I'm going to call on Brendan, because I think he is most familiar with the ins and outs of the API. At that point, controller will invoke on the broker the unbind operation. Brendan, do you happen to know the request and method combination that is to be used with Service Broker API to do that?
I think it's just a delete on the binding.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay. So it does a delete. On V2 service instance, blah, binding, ID2. And depending on what it gets back, the controller can continue doing this until it gets a 200 back. Now, say that this is Happy Land, and this happens, you get your 200 back the first time, life is good. So what controller is going to do is, and here's where we get into kind of low-level stuff. So like, let me push a frame onto the stack. The finalization pattern in Kubernetes is applied to namespaces. And the way it's implemented is that there is a part of the spec, which is the list of finalizers that have to run. And so in this model, we'd have a part of the binding spec that was like list of finalizers. And right now it can just be list of one, which is the controller finalizer. So the controller will do an update then. And here's where this like diagram is starting to break down. We'll have to decide on a new diagram convention.
So Paul, this
Yeah.
is Vijay. So this is sort of kind of what I was worried about, or I wanted us to spend a little bit of time talking about in Seattle when I said that we really need to have state machines, because we talk about defining an API, but we are not really defining an API. We are defining a bunch of resources, and then there's some behaviors that go with them. Mm-hmm. And we are going very deep in the delete here, but for example, simple questions like when can I call delete binding? Or when can I call delete broker? It seems like there's like all these things that we are talking about here also apply to both instance and a binding as well as a service broker as well.
Yes.
And
yeah,
it seems like the proper way to describe this is a state machine.
So Vile, I agree with you. And I chose the binding as an example that's the simplest because we don't have to talk about cascading deletes with binding since it's like a leaf node.
Sure.
So I expect that we can probably use this to like illustrate some core concepts, and then we need to have discussions about every other resource that are like this.
Fair enough. I guess all I'm saying is it also applies to, it even applies to say create binding, right?
Maybe I'm crossing the streams. What's the application to create binding?
Well, create binding needs to go and call the, what's that?
So is the touch point with create, when can I do a create?
No, well, even in the create case, it needs to do a couple of things. It needs to call a broker to go ahead and create the binding. And then if the controller were to immediately die after that, right, then there's also a secret and service instance, what do we call it? The injector policy and things like that that need to be created. So it seems like we should have a similar mechanism that we use at least to describe the state that the resource can be at any given point and what are the possible ways it can go from there. And this one just seems to me like more of the same, but maybe I'm misunderstanding why this one is special.
So this one is special. I think it's not uniquely special, but it's different from the flows that we've discussed before, because this is where we're entering the territory of we need to have like fairly high degree of control over the actual REST API implementation to implement this. Does that make sense? Like the flows we've discussed so far are like you declare your intent by creating a resource, and now we're getting into you declare your intent by deleting a resource, but your resource is not initially actually deleted. There's some things that have to happen, and we're talking about the interplay between the deletion at the API server and the controller. This is where I'll pop a frame off the stack in this conversational stanza and say, I think you've correctly pointed out, there are other concerns like this that I think this discussion kind of helps to ground and socializes the idea that like we need some degree of control over the actual REST API implementation that backs the API that we don't currently have, and that we're going to have to employ to use this to make an API that works the way, works in a sensible way. Does that make sense?
I think so, but I will just shut up and let you draw.
No, I mean, I think this is really good that you raised this because like Ville has raised a very important point, because there is this issue of like, we still need to talk about unbind, or I'm sorry, we still need to talk about deprovision. We still need to talk about what happens when you go and delete a broker, right? Like, and in fact, on the subject of deleting brokers, I think there's a fair amount to talk about vis-a-vis cascades, vis-a-vis leaving orphan things in, what happens. So my intent here was not to prescribe anything, basically just to push the design discussion a little bit further and continue the design momentum that we had in the face-to-face.
Right. So I guess, so the way I think about this, for right or wrong, is that when you create the resource, so whether it's a post instance or whether it's, kube control, create, whatever service or binding or whatever else, a resource is created and then it takes on a life of its own that is controlled by the controller. Yeah. And the way that the state of the resource is communicated to the end user on the left there on the diagram you drew is via conditions. Yeah. And I liken the conditions to states in my small little mind. And I think that any one of those conditions, if it is a state, it has a transition where it can go from that condition to something else. And I think I guess all I'm arguing for is that, to me, that state diagram is for the entire lifetime, not just the deletes. Because I think we have the same. Ideally, we would use the same mechanism to continue to communicate the state of the resource to the user. I think we can agree on that, maybe, so that if, for example, we deleted or created or provisioned or whatever the state might be, it would be great to have a simple mechanism, a single mechanism, and I think that is conditions.
Yeah,
and if
I
those
agree with what you're saying.
And if those are states, then it seems like maybe we could take the binding, maybe step back a little bit more and say, let's go ahead. So first of all, I love this discussion because I think we need to have this, and this is kind of what I was hoping we would have in Seattle. We didn't get around to it yet, but was the state machines, like what state can a resource be in? Let's say it's a binding, and what are the possible states that it can go and come from? But
yeah.
It's a great fair statement, but I just want to make sure we understand that it doesn't start from just creating the resource. It's going to be in some condition. Maybe it's provisioned or bound.
Right. Yeah. So that is a really good point. And I actually have a pull request that adds certain conditions to the API types that we have.
I saw that. Yep.
Okay.
And that. Yep.
Sorry. Go ahead.
No. I was going to say I saw that, and I was curious how you're going to jive that in with this one and the discussion and so forth. And I'm not sure. Well, I guess the first question is how should we go about defining the state machine? What is the mechanism for that? Should it be something like just a state machine diagram with the things, or is that going to be a fancy pants markdown document, or what is the best way to go about that? Because that seems like that's the crux of the problem.
Yeah, so I agree. That is the crux. And like one thing that is missing to me, and perhaps if Brian were here, he could provide some counterexample to me, is like, I do not think that there is any document other than code in Kubernetes that describes those types of transitions. And so my read of this group and my own personal predilection is towards having some kind of document that describes this in some way, so that you can look at it as someone who wants to understand how the system works and say to yourself, oh, okay, well, this is what this API condition means. I don't have precedent that I can look to for like a super great way that's been described anywhere yet. If anybody can point me to a place where it is described in user-facing, easy-to-understand language, I think that's awesome.
I couldn't find any. I spent looking around, and it's described in text. And because English is my second language, I like pictures better.
Yeah, so actually, you know what, Vile? I also have this pull request number 40, where I have tried to, let's see, I made an attempt to begin describing conditions. And I would be happy to have, people's feedback on this, since it's basically around what has been discussed so far. I made an attempt to incorporate the conditions of the different API resources that were dealt with in this pull request into it.
So Paul, since we only have 13 minutes left, was the point of your discussion in the chart or the stuff on the whiteboard to get into the way we determine that something is in the process of being deleted, or was it more about the delete process overall? Because I thought it was more about the delete process and not about conditions versus a state property and stuff like that.
It kind of touched both of them. And basically the primary point though was to get folks thinking about this, because I'm not interested in being dictatorial, and the consensus and socialization of these concepts is really what matters, rather than what any one person wants to do. So I don't expect to create agreement on this. I wanted to expose the concept. If there were not any strong like knee-jerk reactions against it. What I'd want to do is try to write it down and write a picture, draw a picture in some way that we could make in a pull request to have this knowledge live in the repo that we could then agree to or veto, dissent from, et cetera, et cetera. Make sense, Doug?
Yeah, that's fine. I think it seemed like to me what you were trying to present was the overall notion of, I know lazy delete isn't the right phrase for it, but it's the best thing I can think of right now, right? Where you sort of tag it for deletion and then it'll, at some point later, it'll actually vanish. So from the client's perspective, as you said, he'll get back a 202. If he keeps doing the same command over and over, he'll probably still get a 202. And then at some point, the 202 will switch over to a 404.
Yep.
All right. The only question I would have is, on subsequent deletes from the end user perspective, I'm assuming those are pretty much no ops, as opposed to he will redo the lazy delete mechanism. Meaning, let's say, for example, the lazy delete mechanism, or the indication that something is going to be deleted is you set the deleted timestamp, right, from nil to the current time. Mm-hmm. Each subsequent delete from the end user does not re-update that timestamp. It's a no-op, right?
Yes.
That would be the only question I would have in my mind. Okay.
Yeah, so this is actually the, we're getting now back to the point where that I was sort of describing, and it's kind of a messy thing to talk about, right? Because it's like, all right, so you got to delete, you did a delete, you got, a good response, and after that, controller, and I was going to explain the pattern for how this is implemented with namespaces, where what happens with namespace deletion is that, like, as the finalizers for a namespace run, they take themselves out of this list of remaining finalizers, and the API server accepts deletes when that list is empty. So in this case, what the controller would do is it would take itself out of this list of finalizers on the binding, and then once that update was successful, it would do a delete, and that would be the final delete to the API server. The REST API implementation says, okay, this thing has been finalized, I'm good, I can actually delete this thing now. Make sense?
No, that one I may need to be written down, because I didn't see the relationship between the finalizers, but I think when I see it written down, that'll become clear.
Yeah, so it's written down pretty faithfully to how I've explained it in pull request. Oh, what was that number? 39? So since we are getting towards the end of the hour here, perhaps a takeaway that we can have is if folks could look at issue 39. I'm sorry, it's not a pull request, it's an issue. Issue 39, that will probably bring some clarity, and I will try to take some time. At this point, it will probably be tomorrow because I have some stuff to get done tonight to one, see if there's a write-up of the finalization pattern in Kubernetes. Two, see if I can get a more concise description of it. And perhaps we can have our next discussion about no pun intended, finalizing our group understanding of finalization. So since I had the bully pulpit, I wonder, I personally think this has been a really constructive meeting for this group. I am happy that we've worked through like some of these governance things and that we're talking about design again. And what I wonder is, what's the appetite of the group to have another meeting tomorrow?
I'd be on board.
Okay. Kent's in.
Yeah, I think we can do, if we can do same time, same duration.
Okay, I think that would be awesome. This to me is probably the closest we can get to a face-to-face where we're all locked in the room together. So if people have appetite for it, I can make this time frame work every day of the week if I need to.
Just one quick question for you. I'm okay with the meeting tomorrow, but as I was quickly looking through issue 39, in that main paragraph where you talk about the finalizers, you specifically talk about finalizers and namespaces. Are you using namespaces there just as an example, or are these finalizers that operate on bindings part of the namespace?
So I'll go back. That's a good question, Doug. I'll go back and clarify. I think I probably wrote that at like 3 in the morning. So it's probably not the clearest. But I was using namespace as an example because namespace is where the precedent is implemented in Kubernetes.
Okay, that's what I figured. I just wanted to make sure. Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
So can I go back to a dumb question? And I just want to verify, are we considering any case where there might be 2 or more controllers running?
I think that we had agreed that that was not something that we were going to initially do.
Okay, sweet.
Yeah. Okay. So we have about 5 minutes left. Is anybody, I am personally unsure of whether there's a unit of work we can complete in 5 minutes. So unless anybody has anything they want to raise to the group, we can adjourn for today. And I'll see you tomorrow.
I'd say if someone can at least start thinking about that state machine diagram, for lack of a better term, starting a discussion around that sort of deliverable, I think would be super helpful, both in the unbind context as well as, like Vile said, some of those creating instances, service classes, etc. context.
Yeah. Let's call it a condition diagram because many in Kubernetes have a knee-jerk reaction against state machines, and since we want to make something that follows the patterns, let's just call it a condition diagram, and avoid future knee-jerks.
Sounds good.
Okay.
I'm imagining then a PR with a condition diagram on it where we all can comment / ask questions, not only about this particular finalizer logic, but also about which conditions are acted upon, when do we go into the failure condition, and several other kind of open questions, I think.
Yeah, and those I think are the important cases, because I think that, I mean, just looking at the, thanks for writing all that stuff down, Paul, but just following along a happy case and then having branches all over the place where, things take a turn for the worse, then, then go to section 7B. Seems wonky to me, but does anybody have concerns with coming up with a condition diagram in addition to words?
I think it should be totally doable, and I think it is right and good to want to do.
Okay, and so the second question is, does anybody have a open source tool or whatever mechanism they have for creating these that is Kubernetes approved? Or
I unfortunately do not think there is any such thing.
Okay, so does anybody?
I was going to suggest, I think it will be helpful to think of these, instead of states, as a tuple of conditions.
Mm-hmm. Yep, that's fine.
And probably if we have to shove it into a state machine thing, maybe the state that's in a circle is just writing out the tuple.
Yeah. I think there's different ways to do it. I was just curious about drawing, if there's some state approved drawing for those with the GitHub.
The people's condition diagram generator that came out of the Cultural Revolution, I think is what you're asking about.
I've seen a couple different places in Kubernetes where dia was used.
DM.
And
Okay,
they commit both a PNG and the dia file, so somebody can check that out and get it.
Yeah, dia is pretty good. If you roll old school, there's also xfig.
okay.
I think there's also a number of web tools that will generate stuff from like YAML for you too.
Okay, I'll take a look at it then, and I can take a first crack at putting together what something like this could look like. It's going to be very incomplete, but at least it's going to have some placeholders to go and start the discussion. Unless somebody absolutely minds this, I can take an action item to try to.
Okay, that would be awesome, Vila. Would you also look at pull request number 40 and see if it makes sense to you?
Yep. Then I'll try to go and use those things together and put together a skeleton so we can say, is this something we even want, right? Is this one of those things that sounds great, but in practice it's total crap?
I expect that it might take some effort to get to the point where people are happy with it, but I think it will be tremendously valuable to have to explain to users of this API.
Yep.
We're at time now. Thank you everybody for your time today and coming in and joining us. And I will see you all on the internet.
Thank you.
Bye.